Journalist Susan Spencer-Wendel was 44 years old when, whilst undressing to go to bed one night in the summer of 2009, she looked down at her left hand and saw that it was scrawny and pale. Narrating her harrowing illness story in her vivid memoir titled Until I Say Goodbye, Spencer-Wendel said when she looked at her palms, she could see the lines of tendons and the knobs of the bones. She said it seemed like her left hand was dying. And thus, she wrote, began a year-long odyssey of doctors' visits, of attempts to explain my withered limb, to find an answer other than the one John, her husband, who had been researching on his own, mentioned at the end of my first neurologist appointment. ALS. Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast in which we confront the ordeal of motor neuron disease. Spencer-Wendel was almost certain from the start that she was developing motor neuron disease, the almost uniformly fatal disease also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease. She referred to this as a neuromuscular disorder wherein nerves to muscles die, causing the muscles to die as well. She also understood that it was a progressive disorder which, she said, always moves forward from muscle to muscle. Rather sadly, she noted that there is no known cause, no treatment, and no cure. The implication being, she further wrote, that the disease would spread to my arm, then through the rest of my body. She added that I would weaken piece by piece until I was paralyzed, and then usually within 3 to 5 years of the first symptoms, I would die. In depicting her clinical progression, Spencer-Wendel narrated how she began to struggle with yoga poses, with cutting her meals, and with carrying her reporter's handbag. She also described difficulty with walking, leading to recurrent falls, and how she struggled to carry on working and eventually giving up the job she enjoyed. And then, she said, in January 2011, while brushing my teeth, I noticed my tongue twitching. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop it. These twitching movements are called fasciculations, and they have a special significance in motor neuron disease. Let's see another illustrative example of fasciculations, which was provided by Joe Hammond in his MND memoir titled A Short History of Falling. Hammond wrote that his illness began with the sensation that he had a fresh piece of chewing gum stuck in the sole of his foot. His feet also felt bigger when he lifted them up. He also wrote of how his big clown foot made a funny slapping sound as he ran for a bus. This was followed shortly by recurrent falls and clumsiness of his hands. In depicting his fasciculations, he said the loss of motor neurons begins with a display, something visible just beneath the surface of the skin, tiny pulsing movements working their way up my arm like a trapped cricket trying to find its way out. Going on, he wrote that these are the flickerings of a light bulb before the plink and fizz of a blown filament. Tiny faltering premonitions of loss, a kind of panic or disturbance in the muscle that is losing its sense of purpose in the body. Let's take a step back to explore what MND really is. As its name implies, this is a disease predominantly, but we are now realizing not exclusively of the motor nerves. The motor nerves have their cell bodies in the gray matter of the motor area of the brain, of the brainstem, and of the anterior horns of the spinal cord. The first order motor neurons arising from the brain terminate in the brainstem and spinal cord, where they communicate with the second order motor neurons which go on to innervate all the muscles in the body. As the motor nerves degenerate, the muscles they innervate also shrink, weaken and begin to flicker, the dreaded fasciculations. Beyond fasciculations and the other symptoms reported by Spencer-Wendel and Hammond, MND presents with a much broader range of symptoms. Indeed, its diverse onset symptoms makes MND one of the most difficult diagnoses to secure in its early stages. Let's see how this challenge manifested with the case of Philomena, whose story was narrated by her husband John Hardwick in the illness memoir he titled Joined at the Hip. Philomena's symptoms began with neck pain, which persisted after returning from a holiday. Over the subsequent weeks, she started losing weight despite a normal appetite, and she became increasingly tired and fatigued. Even when she developed a dry cough and difficulty swallowing, speaking, and breathing, it is understandable that the focus of her doctors at the time was to investigate her for cancer and other non-neurological problems. It didn't help that her other early symptoms were not diagnostic. These included altered sensations of taste and smell, upper abdominal and loin pain, nausea, and altered bowel habits. Mixed in among these were muscle cramps, one of many other neuromuscular symptoms of motor neuron disease. Eventually, it was her endoscopist who advised that she be seen by a neurologist, who then made the diagnosis of MND. In her case, fasciculations developed much later in the course of her illness and not early as with Spencer-Wendel. Referring to them as fascinations, Hardwick wrote that they were the strangest sight as they looked as though there was something crawling under her skin. Unfortunately, wrote Hardwick, Philomena rapidly lost weight during the following months as her muscles wasted away. He said this was partly because swallowing became impossible and even tiny grains would initiate a choking spasm, and this seemed as if she was being strangled. And just 14 months after her initial symptoms, and just 8 months after her diagnosis, Hardwick said she succumbed to the ravages of this awful disease. Philomena was diagnosed with bulbar onset MND. This is when the condition starts in the muscles that control speech, swallowing, and breathing. Bulbar onset MND is considered more aggressive than the more frequent limb onset variety. Another illustrative example of bulbar onset MND was narrated by Marcel Laperriere in his illness memoir, Just Another Adventure. Laperriere first noticed that his voice would from time to time break, likening it to going through puberty. His condition progressed such that 2 years later, he said, ALS has already robbed me of my ability to speak, and it is robbing me of balance and coordination. And by the 3rd year of his illness, he said, I get much more winded than I did a year ago. He shortly reached what he called the tipping point, the point at which there is no going back. This was when he said he started losing his ability to walk and his breathing sunk to a point that it's a real concern. A year later, Laperriere wrote that I can no longer verbally speak. Chewing and swallowing are difficult. My breathing is labored. My legs no longer function well enough to walk. But an aggressive course can also manifest in limb onset MND. This is graphically portrayed by Sandra Donalds in her book titled A Beautiful Smile. There she chronicled her mother's rapid course of MND. Diagnosed with the disease at the age of 75, her mother's condition deteriorated rapidly to death within 9 months. Like Philomena, Donald's mother also first complained of tiredness and weakness and of needing to rest after only minor exertion. She then complained that something is wrong with her left arm because it is losing strength and she cannot use it very well. When Donalds examined the left upper limb, she said it's swollen from not being used and she can't touch her fingers to her thumb. Donalds also observed that her mother's fingers are starting to curl and she keeps pressing them flat on the table, hoping that that will straighten them out. Just 4 months into her diagnosis, Donalds wrote that her mother was losing her voice and experiencing difficulty breathing, harbingers of the terminal stages of MND. The anecdotes above all show the diversity of onset, cause, and symptoms of MND. But there is also a commonality of symptoms which include easy fatigue, cramps, a tendency to drop objects, poor handwriting, difficulty turning keys and opening bottles due to hand weakness. There's also frequently a tendency to poor balance, difficulty climbing stairs, and falls due to leg weakness. As we have seen, bulbar symptoms are typically late onset, and they include difficulty swallowing called dysphagia, slurring of speech called dysarthria, inability to shout or sing, neck weakness which may manifest as head drop, and of course difficulty with breathing. There are also labile emotions such as inappropriate or pathological laughter and crying. When examined, the limbs are typically stiff and the reflexes exaggerated. These are respectively called spasticity and hyperreflexia. There may also be demonstrable loss of the gag reflex. Although MND is a motor disorder, it may also manifest with non-motor symptoms, and these include sleep disorders such as insomnia, fragmented sleep, and periodic leg movements of sleep. Contrary to previous teachings, MND may also be accompanied by cognitive problems such as poor verbal memory and executive dysfunction, and with mood disorders such as depression and apathy. Also surprising for a predominantly motor disorder, MND can also present with sensory symptoms such as pain and sensory neuropathy. And also contrary to its name, MND may also manifest with autonomic features such as bowel urgency, constipation, spastic bladder, excessive salivation, stinging in the eyes, and a greasy skin. The terminal stages of MND are distressing for the patient, the family, the carers, and also the healthcare practitioners. This is illustrated by Peter Anderson in his illness memoir titled Silent Body, Vibrant Mind. There he referred to MND as a most hideous illness that relentlessly deprived him of such functions as his mobility and his ability to drive. Anderson's narration indeed painted the picture of the remorseless progression of MND. Just 3 years into his diagnosis, he said, "My body had become grotesque and almost unrecognizable to me in terms of its limitations. Every muscle in my body was taut and unyielding like a rusted spring." The following year, he said, "I was only able to awkwardly shuffle my feet. My arms were so stiff I could not properly embrace my daughter, and my hands and fingers would clumsily render tasks that required fine motor coordination virtually impossible." He added that my sleep suffered terribly and I began to learn to ride through the horrible hamstring cramps which would leave me in excruciating pain. He also wrote that my tongue, lips, and jaw were so inflexible that I could not manipulate food around my mouth, purse my lips, or even speak coherently. Furthermore, he said my swallowing reflex became lax, causing me to pull saliva in my mouth, which would then come out streaming every time I lowered my head. Anderson eventually required interventions to help him with feeding, communication, and breathing. The disability, the progression, and the fatality of motor neuron disease makes it one of the most devastating diagnoses that any person can be given. It is no wonder, therefore, that it evokes strong emotions in the person and their families. But these emotions are not always what one would expect from such a devastating disease. Let us take a look at the nature and scope of these emotions as illustrated by TV reporter Ulla Karin Lindqvist in her touching memoir. She was 49 years old and at the height of her career when she developed loss of dexterity in her right hand. She said, "I have a hollow between my thumb and index finger. A muscle has disappeared and my hand has turned into grannies." She added that I fumble and drop things. It's quite normal nowadays. I get cramps in my hands when I write. She then developed muscle twitching, and this was in her right hand, and she likened these to tiny bubbles, the first kicks of a fetus. And as her symptoms progressed, she said, "My strength is ebbing. I keep tripping, and one day my right leg bends backwards when I'm on a brisk winter walk." A year after the onset of her symptoms, she wrote that, "Today I cannot eat without help, walk, or wash myself." It was in this context that she wrote about feeling profound sorrow about everything I am not going to experience. She said, "I am devastated that soon I will leave my 4 children." But instead of a tale of woes, her reflections were also tinted by feelings of bliss. For example, she said, "At the same time, I feel great joy and happiness about everything I'm experiencing at the moment." Several times a day, she said, "My house is filled with laughter." The strange thing, she added, is that nowadays, when I am terminally ill, I feel moments of great joy, such as I have hardly ever felt before. Happiness has never been a constant for me, but now it is becoming one. Lindqvist's attitude to her illness is perhaps the reason that she could feel happiness amid the carnage of MND. For example, she wrote, "I'm going to die of ALS if nothing unpredictable happens. There are 2 roads I can take. One is to lie down, be bitter, and wait. The other is to make something worthwhile of the misfortune." Admitting that seeing her illness positively may appear banal, she asserted, "My road is the second. I have to live in the immediate present." Therefore, although she said in the course of a year I have become a prisoner in my body, she reflected positively that I can laugh, hug my children, hug my husband, read, listen to music, breathe fresh air, wander in the labyrinth of my memory, listen to friends, feel peace within me. Although she accepted that there is no bright future for her, she nevertheless maintained that there is a bright present. And she argued that children live like this, only for the present, nothing coming afterwards. Therefore, she said, I laugh like a child, uncontrollably. Another attitude that Lindqvist adopted was to see and experience everything with intensity. She said, to see something for the last time can be as intense as seeing it for the first time. And to experience something for the last time can be more intense than it was the first. Let's move to the terminology depicting the types of motor neuron disease, something that is quite confusing, not just for the uninitiated, but for those in the know. Many people refer to all forms of MND as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. But many others, however, use the term ALS to refer to the form of MND in which both the first and second order motor nerves are involved. This form of MND produces a mixture of upper motor neuron signs such as stiffness or spasticity and lower motor neuron signs such as wasting of the muscles and fasciculations. In this classification, the term primary lateral sclerosis or PLS is used to define MND which affects only the primary motor neurons. PLS accounts for just 1 to 3% of MND cases, and it is dominated by spasticity or stiffness, especially of the lower limbs. Thankfully, it does not usually convert to ALS on long-term follow-up. And when just the second-order motor neurons are affected, the term progressive muscular atrophy or PMA is used. PMA manifests with only lower motor neuron signs, which include weakness and fasciculations. But unlike PLS, PMA tends to progress to ALS, and this can happen rapidly in about 95% of cases. Other MND variants, which I will not explore in this short podcast, are the Mills variant, which affects just half the body, the Madras variant, which is typically seen in India, and the flail arm syndrome, which manifests with profound weakness and muscle wasting of the upper limbs. As was the case with both Spencer-Wendel and Hammond, most cases of MND are acquired rather than inherited. The reported acquired risk factors of MND include trauma, low body weight, exposure to heavy metals such as lead, mercury, and silica. There's also exposure to formaldehyde, an infection with the human endogenous retrovirus called HERV-K. And occupations such as military service, farming, glasswork, pottery, tile work, and precision tool manufacturing have also been touted as potential MND risk professions. Another curious risk factor is high physical fitness, and this includes playing professional football. This may be the case with Kevin Jordan, who narrated his illness memoir in the book titled Dying to Live. Jordan described himself as someone who has always been incredibly physically active, particularly keen on rugby, which he said was very much part of my life and who I am. Referring to MND as a great taker away, he charted his progression until he said the only independent movement I can manage at the moment is to operate the little drive knob on my wheelchair. I can't shake hands. I can't hug. I'm a prisoner in my own body. Alongside the acquired forms of MND are the genetic types, which are, however, much less frequent. Although she had no family history of MND, Spencer-Wendel's diagnosis at a relatively young age means there is a chance that she had a genetic form of MND. The major genetic risk factors are mutations of the SOD1 and the C9OF72 genes. There is, however, a raft of other genetic predispositions to MND, which are far beyond the scope of this podcast. Although MND was the final diagnosis she was given, Spencer-Wendel had to go through assessments to rule out a variety of disorders that may mimic MND. And the first group of mimics are the benign conditions that can manifest with fasciculations. These include physiological causes such as benign fasciculations, coffee consumption, and physical activity. Spencer-Wendel also wrote of the peripheral nervous system mimics of MND which were considered in her case, and these included Hirayama disease and multifocal motor neuropathy. In Laperrier's case, presenting as he did with significant speech difficulties, the main mimics his doctors needed to rule out were primary progressive aphasia and spasmodic dysphonia. But the list of mimics is much longer and includes spinal muscular atrophy, Kennedy disease, post-polio syndrome, and myasthenia gravis presenting with anti-MuSK antibodies. Others include inclusion body myositis, brachial neuritis, and familial amyloid neuropathy. There are also other central nervous system mimics such as multiple sclerosis, cervical myelopathy, hereditary spastic paraparesis, syringomyelia, vitamin B or copper deficiency, and adrenomyeloneuropathy. This is for the specialist. The non-neurological mimics of MND include hypothyroidism, hypoparathyroidism, and even Lyme disease. To To help me explore the clinical perspectives of MND further, I will be speaking to top neurologist Alan Dropper, who also co-wrote the book Reaching Down the Rabbit Hole, in the next podcast. Thank you very much for listening to or watching this podcast in which we explored motor neuron disease. If you found this podcast enlightening, you may consider subscribing to Neuro Checklist, my website, which gives more information about the neurology of MND. Or you might want to read my book called Surfing the Brain, where I approach neurology in a more down-to-earth way. And to ensure you do not miss my next podcast, in which I will be speaking to Alan Dropper, why not subscribe to the YouTube, Apple, or Spotify channels of the podcast? Until then, thank you very much for your time.